Good afternoon. I'm Kathryn Paik, Senior Fellow here with the Australia Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Over the past few years, we've seen a significant increase in U.S. engagement across the Pacific Islands region after decades of relative neglect. This is due to several factors, including China's increasingly aggressive influence activities across the region, as well as the mounting threat of climate change, which disproportionately affects many of these island countries. The Solomon Islands is the third biggest Pacific island country and is home to some of the most pivotal battles of World War II, including Guadalcanal. Until recently, the Solomon Islands was also one of the few remaining diplomatic allies of Taiwan on the global stage. However, in 2019, Solomon Islands switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. Following this, then Prime Minister Sogavare also looked to China to fulfill much more of the economic and security needs of the Solomon Islands in a way that concerned many of the Solomon Islands' traditional partners. This switch set off alarm bells across the U.S. and Australia and many others. And this became increasingly heightened after PRC and Solomon Islands signed a security agreement in 2022. Many in the U.S. and the West saw this as a clear sign of China's ambitions to gain a foothold across the Pacific Islands. To dig a little bit deeper into the outcomes and the implications of these developments, I'm thrilled to be joined here today by Edward Cavanough, author of Divided Isles, Solomon Islands and the China Switch. Ed Cavanough is an author, journalist, and currently the executive officer at the McKell Institute, an Australian public policy institute. Previously, he gained experience in both the private and public sectors in Australia and the US as an IT consultant, an electorate officer in South Australia, and a campaign intern for a US congressman in Washington, which we might have to go into a little bit more. He has published extensively on economic inequality, international trade, indigenous policy, and more. But of course, he is also the author of Divided Isles, the Solomon Islands, and the China Switch. Thanks, Ed, for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be with you.
So the main premise of your book is that much of the global community failed to capture really the full picture or consider how and why decisions were made on the ground in the Solomon Islands prior to this switch. I'd really like to start by stepping back a little bit and asking you how the idea for this book evolved. You know, you talk through several periods of travel and interest in the Solomon Islands. This was interspersed with other work you were doing from Australia and a global pandemic. So when did you realize that there was really an angle here that hadn't been explored?
Well, yeah, look, it's a funny sort of story in some ways. So I've been spending a lot of time both sort of in the think tank world here in Australia, but also traveling around the world as a freelance reporter, sort of scratching around, you know, getting paid a few $100s to do a story here and there, and realizing, you know, it's kind of tough to make a buck, but also, you know, a hell of a good time to go and sort of learn about the world in that journalistic pursuit. It was sort of 2018, 2019, I started doing some serious work, both for the think tank I worked at, but also in terms of journalism projects over in Solomon Islands. I'd been looking in particular at an issue around energy poverty and around some of these development challenges that were happening. So in early 2019, I was spending a fair bit of time, went to Solomon Islands a couple of times for that work. And as often happens when you're doing some freelance journalism and these sort of freelance projects, I was pitching a whole range of stories all through the year, largely on, you know, ecotourism and green tourism and all this sort of stuff, and kind of drawing on my experience of the region when many of those stories were getting rejected, as that tends to happen. But lo and behold, sort of later on in 2019, I received this very random sort of lucky break in many ways, where The Guardian commissioned me to fly up to Solomon Islands just in the few days after this switch had occurred, after the Sogavare government, now at that point just about 6 months into its tenure, had decided to sever ties with Taiwan and open this relationship with Beijing. And what happened in those first few, I guess, days and weeks after the switch occurred was that there was this huge amount of international coverage and international concern, understandably. It was a really seismic shift in the region's geopolitics. It felt like it came on very, very quickly. And there were, you know, commentators from all the way up from, you know, U.S. President Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Marco Rubio, for example, coming out and having very sort of aggressive opinions on this, all the way through to the Australian broadsheets sort of arguing from quite some distance about what the impact of all of this was. And what was missing in those early days after the switch was the sort of on the ground assessment of what do people actually in Solomon Islands, in this very diverse, very complicated country, actually think about this major decision. So I was asked by The Guardian to go over and tell that story. And so for really the first few weeks after the switch, I was on the ground trying to get a sense of what was going on. And what became, I think, quite immediately clear was that, yes, there was the sort of international mega, 30,000 foot geopolitical story happening. There were those threads that were kind of driving some of this, but it was also very much a kind of local story. And a lot of the build up to the switch, a lot of the aftermath, a lot of the positioning was, I think, very specific to Solomon Islands. And it was, you could see that people in the country were starting to sort of gear up for an interesting period where there were going to be, factions would have one side or another, and there was going to be a sort of a bit of a tumult coming together. So really over the next few years beyond that, I kept getting opportunities to tell this story as it was unfolding, and after some time, I guess it emerged into enough material to put together into a book. But the sort of genesis of it was this idea that this was a huge geopolitical story, a geopolitical event, but for me, the gap in the coverage was always that sort of ground up perspective and getting a sense of what local communities were experiencing in such a seismic moment.
Something I really appreciated about Divided Isles is that it was very clear that you were trying to come at this subject from the consideration of the Solomon Islands perspective, not just the U.S. China perspective or U.S. Australia. In other words, it's not about us, right? It's about them. However, of course, you're Australian, not Solomon Islander. So how did you kind of reconcile that or think about that or take that into consideration as you were crafting this book?
It's a really good question, because I'm very conscious of the dynamic and the problem in many ways of this sort of extractive storytelling. I didn't move to Solomon Islands. I wasn't living there for the last 5 years. I was a fly-in, fly-out journalist, and there's problems with that, and there's certainly things that you would omit and might not be able to observe in the same way that a local reporter would. I guess that the answer to that really is that the story sort of evolved. And I as I said, didn't intend necessarily from day one to say, okay, fantastic, here's my first book, here's this opportunity I'm going to pursue. But as I kind of kept working on the story and kept working on various aspects of the switch story, like from 2019 onwards, it became clear that that original problem that I sort of identified, which was that a lot of the narrative of the switch was just being dictated from outside, that was persisting, and there still wasn't a huge amount of local, detailed, on the ground reporting that was feeding into the Australian commentary on the switch necessarily, but also the sort of broader international commentary as well. Solomon Islands does have a remarkably competent, sophisticated media ecosystem. And actually, there are a lot of great journalists, there are a lot of great local reporting, but that doesn't necessarily always feed into our international press and international coverage of the place. So really, it felt like there was an opportunity and a need to kind of tell a story from the perspective of that country, try and bring as much local storytelling as possible into that, but really direct it to a global audience and to an audience of folks in Canberra and Washington, D.C.
What were some of as you were analyzing this and it was coming about and becoming this broader story, what were some of the key Western misperceptions that you came across that you were really aiming to counter? And do you think those are persisting?
It wasn't necessarily completely out of the blue. People had been talking about this for some time in Solomons. But nevertheless, for much of the, us observers outside, it seemed like this just happened. It was just sprung onto the international community. And what I think people were kind of seeing in that was that Solomon Islands had no agency in this decision whatsoever. That this was another example of China's sort of, unilateral capacity almost to come into the region and to dictate things. And that fed into our broader fear, particularly in Australia, of, losing the Pacific to China. So the story very quickly was that, look, this country is sort of being pushed around by China. It's doing what China wants to say, and it doesn't necessarily have, any control of what's going on here. And I think that was just too narrow a reading of the dynamics that led up to the switch. One of the things I really tried to do in the book is articulate that, yes, there's obviously Chinese interests in what happened in the lead up to the switch, of course, but a lot of the determinants of it and the determinants of the timing of it were driven internally within Solomon Islands. As I said, there had been emerging push for this for some time. There were a lot of backbench MPs on Sogavare's backbench that wanted a relationship with China. A lot of the push towards the Chinese relationship was driven by the ethnic Chinese business community in Solomon Islands, who have always really been in Solomon Islands, have a sort of dominant economic position, and saw an opportunity in normalizing ties. So I think from the very outset, it was clear that there were local determinants that were equally driving the China switch. It wasn't just being sort of thrust onto a country that had no opportunity to do so. And that's really the sort of, I guess, narrative of the rest of the book, that there is, often we feel like all of these outcomes are being dictated from outside of a country like Solomon Islands, when in actual fact, often there's sort of otherwise relatively powerless actors that are more or less in the driver's seat. And there's a lot of stories throughout the book that I talk about that highlight that.
So I'd like to dig into this idea of agency a little bit more, because you do bring this up, and it's in the inside cover, of course, this idea that there are actors in Solomon Islands that were able to perhaps take advantage of certain situations, or at least be a little more politically savvy than we give them perhaps credit for in our Western media. So focusing in a little bit on former Prime Minister Sogavare, because he's a key factor here, of course. You spend quite a bit of time in the beginning of the book talking about his motivations leading up to the switch, some of the different factors. And you assert, of course, that it's much more complex than he's simply pro-China or anti-US, anti-Australia. Sogavare has insisted several times that the PRC will not get a base. And that is a key concern of the US and Australia and others, that because of the security agreement that is still not been published, that the PRC will get a base in Solomon Islands. Sogavare insists that that's not the case. Many in the West might say that, given PRC's track record globally in other locations, this is a clear roadmap, and that is an obvious PRC objective to get a base, regardless of what we're hearing on the ground. So with that in mind, there's kind of two conclusions one could take. One is that Sogavare is complicit and is essentially lying to us when he says they're not going to get a base, or on the other hand, is naive and overconfident in his ability, in the Solomon Island government's ability to navigate this Chinese engagement. Where do you think he falls on that spectrum, if at all, and what do you say to that?
Well, I think he's incredibly confident. That's more, if I was there was that binary between sort of complicity and sort of an overconfidence that he can navigate those dynamics, I'd certainly lean towards the latter. The reason is, one of the things I wanted to put in this book, which really hasn't been published before, was a very detailed biography, effectively, of Manasseh Sogavare, who's no longer the Prime Minister, but he is a dominant force in the modern history of Solomon Islands. As I said before, until he recently lost his position at the recent election, he was in his fourth attempt at the prime ministership. He first got elected to Parliament in the late 1990s. He'd been a senior public servant for many years before that, and he'd sort of been in and out of the leadership in some form for 20-odd years in Solomons. And he is a distinct character in the national politics of the country. His mentor, his very close mentor, was one of the former prime ministers of Solomon Islands, a man named Solomon Mamaloni, who was a, kind of brawler, nationalist, populist type figure, who back in the 1980s and back in the sort of early 90s, when he was dominant, very savvily, with a lot of sophistication, would play off the United States and the Soviet Union and Australia to gain concessions all the time. So Sogavare has always seen the sort of opportunity in great power competition, leveraging that for his own interests. He also is deeply skeptical, genuinely, of of the Australia relationship, and he does have actually quite a lot of animus towards Australia due to his history. Several times during when he'd lost the prime ministership in the past, he'd actually blamed Australia largely for that. There was, of course, this very long-standing peacekeeping operation in Solomon Islands between 1999 and 2003 and 2017. During the time, Australia effectively had control of a lot of the apparatus of state, which was a pretty remarkable situation and kind of an affront to Sogavare's sort of nationalist impulses. And I think it was in 2006 where he actually had his personal prime ministerial office raided by the Australian Federal Police in relation to an investigation they were committing. So he has no love lost for Australia. He genuinely he sees value in the relationship economically, but he doesn't feel any sort of loyalty or particular emotional ties to Australia. So in that sense, when he came to power again, the fourth time around, he was determined to stick in power, but he also saw opportunities to kind of execute many of his sort of long-standing, I guess, beliefs and his vision for the country generally. And I think he saw a profound opportunity in the Chinese interests in Solomon Islands to achieve some of those gains, but he was also confident enough to do that and not so loyal to the Australians that he felt that he couldn't do that. So I think you're right going back. I mean, there is, he has been very adamant that there would never be a Chinese naval base. I don't think it's in his interests, in the current Solomon Islands government's interest for that to happen necessarily. But that's, and I think they're genuine about that. But yeah, you're right. There's not always this, I think that's a difficult thing to guarantee forever. And I think they're not so much complicit, but I do think there's a confidence that they can handle that relationship. And yeah, perhaps they've maybe become overconfident, but I think that's the dynamic that we're looking at there. Yeah.
Yeah, and it should be noted that Sogavare, there's never been a prime minister in Solomon Islands that has had concurrent prime ministerships, and we very well could see him again. He's certainly not out for the count at this point. In fact, he's been, put into a very key position.
He's a finance minister. He told people very openly during his last term in government that his primary objective was to last a full term. It was like his big ambition was to survive an entire parliamentary term. It is very, very rare for that to happen. It's only happened a couple of times in the country's history. He'd never been able to achieve that before. So that was one of his primary motivations over the last few years as well.
Yep. So keeping on the Sogavare topic just for the time being, I also need to question you a little bit on, you talk about all the various motivations that Sogavare has and had coming into the switch. However, one thing that you don't really mention that has been in the news quite a bit is this idea of money flow, right? And there's been quite a bit of reporting about straightforward corruption, PRC money coming in to Sogavare to route to other MPs and basically buying the ability to stay in power. And potentially even put off the recent elections. Was there a reason for that, or do you really think that wasn't as much of a factor as being made in the West? Just curious your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, at a high level, I mean, there's absolutely a lot of dark money in Solomon Islands. It's rife with corruption. There's a chapter in the book where I sort of talk about the existence of corruption generally in Solomon, some of the efforts of activists to stamp that out as much as possible. And undoubtedly, when the switch occurred, there were some relatively shady deals coming into the place. Well, very quickly after the switch was announced in September 2019, a senior Chinese official announced this sort of early harvest, as they called it, of the relationship, which was the funding of a effectively defunct and relatively poor quality gold mine in the country, which has always sort of been limping along. And there was this, I think something like $800 million commitment to develop infrastructure for it, to reanimate it, which most analysts said this is sort of absurd. This is a crazy amount of money coming into the country given that mine. So there's projects that have been popping up all over the place in the country that are certainly, deserve serious scrutiny and likely seeing a lot of dark money flowing into the place. Sogavare himself, of course, is always been alleged to be involved in that sort of behaviour. He, like many other MPs, many other longer-term MPs, find themselves incredibly wealthy after a couple of decades in Parliament. There's this sort of saying in Solomons, if you want to become a millionaire, become an MP. They have very, very small salaries. They all happen to have the nicest cars in the country and private islands and all of this sort of stuff. So the existence of dark money flowing into the pockets of politicians is clear. It's sort of unavoidable. It is difficult though, as all dark money sort of flows are, to kind of identify specifically the origins of that. You look at Sogavare's wealth, he has several houses. One can only really speculate about the origins of that. So I didn't want to necessarily hone in on the fact that this is the primary motivation going on here. Sogavare has a lot of complicated determinants that drive his behavior. One of them, I'm sure, is his own sort of personal advantage of being having the financial advantages that you get becoming the Prime Minister and such an influential politician. But I wanted to kind of tell a bit of the broader story of that nationalist impulse that there is in Solomon Islands through Sogavare's story too, and not simply just say, well, he must be corrupt, he must be complicit, and that's why this is all happening, because I think there's just more under the surface than just a simple story of money's dictating what's going on here.
Kind of angling off of that in terms of the Chinese interests in some of the areas of the Solomon Islands, you detail in several places the ways that Chinese companies and investment can be highly extractive and predatory throughout the Solomon Islands, especially for local leaders in certain areas that might get pennies on the dollar to give up vast amounts of resources. But one thing I found also really interesting, and you talked about this specifically in Malaita, can be the way that provincial leaders can really struggle to curb that, even if they want to. For example, the Premier of Malaita, Daniel Swidani, has made very clear his desire to limit or eliminate all the Chinese investment, PRC investment coming into Malaita, and yet he has been unable to necessarily do so due to that tension between the large local government and then you've got the autonomous tribal leaders. Could you just dive into that a little bit more for us and explain that complexity? Because it seems a little counterintuitive, I think, to some of us in the West.
Yeah, well, so one of the kind of big stories that emerged from the narrative arc of this book really is that you had this split in the country in many ways, but between sort of a pro-Taiwan and pro-China kind of movement, I guess, in some ways. And the leader of that campaign against the Chinese involvement in Solomon Islands was the Premier of Malaita province, the largest province in the country, constitutes about 50% of the population, the ethnic Malaitan community. And Daniel Swidani, this relatively sort of novice politician who became Premier of that province just around the same time as the switch occurred, very quickly emerged as the leading opponent of Chinese investment, Chinese involvement in Solomon Islands more broadly. One of his very first pledges after, he actually kind of worked quite closely with various community groups that were also agitating around the China issue. But one of his first pledges and one of his biggest commitments was that there will simply be no money from China flowing into our province. That's just a black and white rule. It will not happen, not on my watch. A very popular argument. It was, the local people were very sympathetic towards Taiwan. They saw value in that. It genuinely was widely supported in the province. But you're right, it's actually not as simple as that in the country. The provincial governments have a fair bit of autonomy in Solomon Islands, but they don't have the same degree of autonomy necessarily as even a US state would or an Australian state necessarily. It is a federation, but they're very limited in their spending power, in their tax revenue, all this sort of stuff. The one lever the provincial governments do have is the issuance of business licenses. And their argument was effectively that, well, what we can do is we just won't give a business license to any Chinese business operating in the province. But it didn't necessarily work that simply, because what occurred, and I tell this story sort of towards the end of the book, that after a while, some of these Chinese companies that were operating in Solomons just started sending people over to prospect and to sign up deals with local communities and to particularly around extractive industry sort of exploration and things like that. And the provincial government simply didn't have the legislative or sort of resources or anything, legislative capacity, financial resources, personnel prohibit that in any sense. And once that sort of became clear, I think some of the big pledge, the big promise to sort of stop all Chinese investment kind of water a bit thin for a lot of people, because they just saw, okay, well, now we're making this big pledge. We can't actually enforce it, but it's still stifling investment and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's just one of the dynamics where you have a lot of agency at the very, very local level, where traditional leaders, tribal leaders do have the authority to kind of sign up deals with potential investors. And of course, there's a sort of open door at the national level, and some of those provincial governments were caught in between.
And was this, do you think, often just a result of local leaders needing some sort of support or some sort of money, or was there any sort of, I guess, desire to partner with the Chinese investors coming in for any particular reason?
I think fundamentally, what the book tells really from the first moment is, and something that we need to always be conscious of and remind ourselves of in this conversation, is just how truly desperate so many people in that country are. You know, Solomon's is just a phenomenal place. It's one of the great sort of joys in the world, is traveling around Solomon Islands. It's absolutely beautiful. People are very happy. There's a lot of richness in the country, but it's also, you know, suffering abject poverty. If you go into almost any regional community, the most basic needs are simply not met. There's this very vibrant traditional life which people want to maintain and people respect, but there's also no medicine. There's no refrigeration. The roads don't work. People are dependent entirely on diesel generators, which is extraordinarily expensive. So people feel like the economy simply doesn't exist for them and doesn't work for them in any sense. And when you're a local leader and you have, you know, say you're a chief of a village of 300 or 400 people, and someone comes in and says, hey, we are going to sort of go up the hill there and drill some holes into the ground, and we'll pay you, you know, $50 or $100 US each time we do that. It's just remarkably tempting to open the door to that. So there is a yearning for some sort of economic support. You know, I traveled all around Malaita through the course of this book, and the first thing that happens when you get into one of the most remote villages is that you have all of the older folks come over to you and ask if you have medicine for them. And they come over and you hand them, you know, basic like Panadol, painkillers, that sort of thing. And there's just as I said, while there's this sort of phenomenal traditional life that people want preserved, they are hungering for those absolute basics as well. So it just opens the door. It just means when there are sort of savvy, ambitious business people, whether they're from China or anywhere else, there's an opportunity there to sign up very, very localized deals, particularly around prospecting for mining interests, and to do so without giving a fair deal at all. But it's better than nothing in the eyes of some of the local people.
That makes sense. Staying a little bit on Malaita, because a lot of your book is about Malaita itself, which I thought was, again, I really appreciated, because, again, from the West, if Malaita is brought up, even though it's one of the most highly populous provinces in Solomon Islands, it tends to be in a very simplified fashion, right? It's the pro-Taiwan piece of the story, and that's it. Of course, you found it much more complex on the ground, as would be expected. Could you just talk a little bit more about what you were seeing and hearing on the ground as you were going around, and that Taiwan piece that we hear so much from the outside?
Yeah. So in that very first reporting trip I did, I went straight over to Auki, the capital of Malaita, because that was where all that very vocal opposition towards the China switch was emerging from very, very quickly. And in that first trip, I think it was in October or November 2019, you know, the anger towards the Sogavare government, the anger towards China was sort of palpable and electric and in the air. And you could even see, I was there about a month maybe after the initial protests, and there were signs littered around the ground still saying, you know, we don't need China, no need China, all this sort of stuff. And that anger was very real and genuine. And the reason it was there was not simply because there was this sort of innate opposition towards China, though there is that is part of the discourse in Malaita, but it was the fact that this was thrust upon Malaita by the national government without their consent. That was reflective of the kind of whole history of modern Solomon Islands, where the people in Malaita, the sort of dominant island, the largest population base, have often felt that despite their power and influence, central governments sort of tell them what to do. And it's this classic sort of, outsider insider mentality that you see in a lot of countries, but people in Malaita feel like they're fundamentally ignored. And when the China switch occurred, this really fundamental change, it was very fertile ground, that sentiment, for agitators who were very opposed to China to whip up, genuine anger about that. So there was that sort of emotional aspect of it. Taiwan, despite not being a huge investor in Solomon Islands, in that they weren't the biggest aid partner necessarily, they were very, very visible on the ground. And they were very visible in Malaita too. So there were these technical assistance programs they had around the island, where they were just doing, training people up around agricultural techniques and all this sort of stuff. And you could even see in local markets in Malaita a kind of diversified food supply, largely as a result of these Taiwanese programs. So the Taiwanese were also very much loved and respected and kind of admired in Malaita by a lot of people. When the switch happened, they literally dropped tools and went straight home. So, I went to some of these Taiwanese aid projects, like genuinely they dropped the tools. So there's all the stuff is just there from that day, and the people were in limbo. So at that initial moment, there was just this very fertile ground, as I was saying, for, political agitators really to kind of push this narrative that we're getting ignored, we're getting left behind. And for the most sort of hardened Malaita nationalists, that always aspired for Malaita to become a nation of its own. There's no logical reason necessarily that, if you look back on it, that Malaita shouldn't be an independent country when Bougainville is, for example, which is just nearby, similarly ethnically diverse from, other parts of the Solomon Archipelago, for example. Now, there's a lot of practical reasons Malaitan state won't happen, but for those hardliner Malaita nationalists' voices, they saw in the China switch this opportunity to pursue that ambition, to mobilize the public, mobilize the local provincial government against the national government, and to start the process potentially of creating this sort of pro-Taiwan, pro-democracy, pro-Christian independent state that was separate from the national government. So that's what sort of occurred initially. Warping forward a few years, and I've been there sort of many times since that initial trip. As we mentioned before, some of those big promises of the provincial government, which were that we'll never engage with China, we'll never do this and that, simply weren't delivering outcomes for most people on the ground. And when you started to travel around the island, there was still that anger towards the national government. There was still that frustration that this decision had been thrust upon them. But in equal parts, there was this frustration that those most basic economic needs that people had simply weren't getting met as well. There were big promises when the switch happened that, well, because we're pro-Taiwan, the United States and Taiwan and Australia will come and support us and they'll develop us and all this sort of stuff. Big promises happening, very little delivery on the ground. People were familiar with that in Solomons, I guess, but by sort of 2022, 2023, people were that was wearing thin. And there was just that basic economic necessity that people needed. There was a more open-mindedness to the virtues of Chinese investment because they saw some of these big projects happening elsewhere in the country. So that fundamental kind of anti-China brand of Malaita, it's certainly genuine. There's a huge amount of people in that province that maintain that view and still maintain that view. But it waned over time, and now we see what you expect in most other politics, where you just have a diversity of views. I would say that those motivated by the China issue are now much fewer than there were 4 or 5 years ago.
So this is interesting. It brings us a little bit fast forward into current events. And of course, your book is quite recent, but a lot has happened since it came out. So near the end of the book, you note that I think you say by the end of 2022, you noted that, in your opinion, Swadani, his popularity was indisputably weakening. And then, of course, in 23, we had a most likely orchestrated from Honiara ousting of Swadani. But in this most recent election, he, of course, was very widely popular, elected back into his position, and the Martin Feeney, who had replaced him in 2023, lost his seat. So how do you read that popularity, and is there a swing back towards that pro-independence movement, or is it just Swadani's popularity and his ability to potentially deliver on what he said?
So Sudani was sort of legally ousted with this sort of quite Machiavellian, maneuver from the Sogavare government's provincial government minister, whatever the name of the minister is, who effectively had agency over local and provincial governments to appoint and unappoint people. The way that, provincial politicians are formally appointed is through, they get signed off by the national government. So they effectively used a pretty unsavory way to oust him from his seat. But prior to that, he'd actually had been outmaneuvered in the provincial assembly and lost his premiership. So he was the premier of the province. But the way that the premiers are appointed in Solomon Islands isn't through a big popular vote across the entire island. It's very much through the negotiated scrum post-election of 30 independents or so who are in that provincial assembly deciding who will be the premier. So when he came to power, he didn't necessarily come to power through some popular groundswell of he actually won his seat by only 9 votes. And these seats are, it's kind of hard to almost imagine it really from a US or an Australian perspective, even, where some of these seats are like 400, 500 voters. I think his particular seat had something like 900 electors. So these are very much, local government type size elections. So he lost his premiership, I think early in 2023, maybe it was early. Yeah, it would have been early 2023. But then was ousted as a member of his provincial assembly through that very sort of Machiavellian maneuver, as I mentioned. So in the recent election, he did retain his seat, but he hasn't been able to forge a government. So he's now sort of a standalone member of that provincial assembly, but he's not the premier. So he still is a popular figure. I think that's indisputable. A broader measure, though, of his popularity was this political party that he helped create, which is called You Me for Change. And that did not do well at those elections. So I think while Sudani is still respected and liked by a lot of people in the province, it's not as simple as saying, well, he's on the rise, or he's sort of universally loved. The dynamics around elections in Solomons are very much driven by local issues. As I said, sometimes 50 or 100 votes can swing an entire seat. Incumbents typically have extraordinary power and influence over that because they allocate so many resources. There is a lot of vote buying. Before an election, you'll see local politicians come with bags of rice with mini solar panels and things like that and literally bequeath them to voters asking for their vote. So it's hard to properly gauge the full sense of public opinion necessarily from these elections as well.
So I have many more questions for you, but before I dive into more of mine, I do want to just pop out to some of our audience questions.
Right.
So we have one that's come in that asks, to what extent do you believe Sogavare's refusal to speak with you, and I assume they're mentioning the times in the book when you mentioned wanting to speak with him and you were politely refused, with you compared to Swadani, Atu, and others' willingness to speak with you, influence your perception? Does that influence your perception of his administration and the events that played out under it?
That's such a good question. I spent about 5 years trying to interview Sogavare and failed, and was the only sort of silver line to that was I was not the only one who failed. He effectively shut out all media, international media engagements almost his entire time in office in that final premiership of his. There's a story in the book where I was actually on the plane up to Solomons, and there was a Washington Post reporter who was also there, and Sogavare was on the same plane. And this Washington Post reporter, went and tried to just corner him in the plane and speak to him. And he got even not, he was very polite, but that was about as close as an international reporter got to him for 3 or 4 years. So Sogavare was just deeply skeptical of, as I said before, he had this very tense relationship with Australia. He just did not trust international media to report on these dynamics as he saw them of the switch and of everything. So he really did just do a total media shutout. you'd engage his advisors and they'd say, oh yeah, we'll think about it, and then it just would never happen. He did occasionally speak to do a press pool or whatever at an international summit or something, but it was incredibly rare. So that was frustrating. And yeah, the other senior politicians in the country were incredibly open, and they were incredibly willing to give as much of their time as possible to international reporters. I talk about that as a sort of illustration of this agency, though, that sometimes we ignore, where Matthew Wale, the former opposition leader, Daniel Sidani, Peter Kenilworth Jr. were on speed dial for basically every foreign reporter looking at the Solomon Islands issue, and really were in the driver's seat of the international narrative of what was going on. They very successfully, very skillfully painted Sogavare as a dictator, as an autocrat. There might have been elements of truth to aspects of what they're saying, but nevertheless, it was in their political interest to paint Sogavare in that way. And they were really the only people speaking to the international media. So I talk a bit about in the book that yes, these folks were very capable of engaging folks like myself and other international reporters and providing and just shaping the narrative. And I think that was a mistake of Sogavare, despite the fact that he did achieve his ambition to last that entire term. A kind of more conciliatory approach to the international media would have told, I think, a broader story of what was going on over that period in Solomons. And one of the reasons why, I think the story is as it is because he fundamentally ignored that. And just one more point on the media stuff. Every single time I wrote a single word anywhere in the international press on Solomon Islands, you very quickly see those words ricocheting around Solomon Islands social media feeds. The country is sort of largely online, but almost exclusively through Facebook. It's like many developing countries, that is the internet. And, I would interview someone and then you'd see them sharing that, and it would validate their opinion or validate themselves as a sort of big figure in the country's politics. So I was conscious as the story developed that I was effectively being used without it being a sort of in a nefarious way per se, but my kind of capacity to get international stories up was certainly being leveraged by all of these folks to get their quotes in the press, not only to craft the international story, but to amplify themselves at home too.
So I'm curious, you say that, Wale, Kenilworth, others were very savvy at, as you say, wanting to paint Sogavare as a dictator per se. And then you said, that may have been true. Do you see evidence or do you see signs that necessarily wasn't the case? I mean, we've seen several very concerning indications that the push off of the elections for a year, for example, was quite significant in the Solomon Islands system and very alarming globally. We've seen, backsliding of democracy in the country. So, what makes you think that there isn't like a genuine concern over the direction that Sogavare was taking the country, and that's where those voices were coming from?
I have sympathy for some of that narrative, but I thought it was always a little bit overcooked. For a few reasons. I mean, one of them being that he's no longer the Prime Minister, so he didn't hold on to that position, and the reason was he lost support of his parliamentary colleagues, not necessarily because that was what led to his sort of ouster. So I was always sort of arguing that while he was uniquely able to consolidate power during that term of government, we just didn't know for sure if he'd be able to continue that. It was just that, and it's an imperfect democracy perhaps, but it is a nature of that democracy too. One of the things that often was omitted as well with the pushing out of the election, despite I agree that was not the most not the wisest thing to do probably if you're Sogavare, but Sogavare was determined for a few things. One was lasting an entire parliamentary term. The biggest project he'd ever undertaken in politics was the Pacific Games, this big sporting event that happened, I guess, late last year now. And he, in his third prime ministership, lobbied very hard to have the Pacific Games held in Solomon Islands. He sort of kickstarted that entire process, and he returned to power in 2019 and was determined to cut the ribbon on it effectively. One of his reasons he was skeptical of Taiwan in a large part was because they had actually initially promised to help out with the Pacific Games. He saw more value in China helping out with the Pacific Games. You know, he felt that he might not hold on to power in that if the election was in 2023, push the election out beyond the Pacific Games, cut the ribbon of the Games, and then he sort of was ousted at the next election. So I think, yeah, I'm just skeptical of the idea that he necessarily wanted to consolidate power for the next 20, 25 years. I think he wanted to dominate the political system while he was in control. I think it just didn't fundamentally surprise me necessarily that he didn't nominate for the position of Prime Minister at this recent election. I think ultimately he's still beholden to the oscillations and the maneuvers of his parliamentary colleagues, if not necessarily the broader public opinion in the country.
So I think we could probably go on this subject for quite a while, but I do want to get to sort of where you ended in the book, and what I think is really of top priority for U.S. policymakers, especially, and also those in Australia, is where do we go from here in terms of what, as donor countries, as development partners that want to be substantial development partners in the Pacific, how should the U.S. and Australia be looking ahead? I noted at the end in your epilogue, I believe you give some suggestions. You talk a little bit about this idea of macro trends in terms of this idea of giving these general development promises that don't really drill down into, as you say, the micro interventions that are needed. Could you talk a little bit more about what you see as necessary when Australia and the U.S. look at our next steps in the Solomon Islands?
So one of the kind of interesting, there's a lot of introspection that happens when suddenly there's a sort of new big player on the scene. And there is this narrative, I think, and this concern that, we should be just fundamentally scared that China are now involved in the Pacific in a serious way. For me, that's an inevitable outcome of this moment in geopolitics. We have this sort of rising power. They're going to have relationships all across the region. What I think Australia and the United States should be doing more of is seeing this moment for really the opportunity that it is to reset some of their own approach in the region. China's approach since coming into Solomons has been engaging in sort of politically expedient project grants and delivery that placate the political leaders of these countries, but don't necessarily fundamentally change anything on the ground at all. As I said, Sogavare was very savvy at maintaining power for his time there. He was not a popular person. And China's approach in Solomons has largely been, what does the Prime Minister of the day want us to do? We will provide that and then have sort of, political power over that individual. That's deeply unpopular in a country like Solomons, where so much of the aid and so much of the investment is just concentrated into this capital city that only has 20% of the population. And you literally go 2, 3, 4 kilometers outside of the capital, and all of the same problems that have been there for the last century persist and remain. There's this story I tell with this chief in Malaita called Arnon, who, had this night. I was basically waiting for a car for like 2 or 3 days or something in his village, and I had this night with him. He was talking about, he remembered when the country became independent in 1978, and he said, we were promised that there were going to be like new roads and new schools and new this and that. And he said 50 years later, like, they're still waiting for the exact same promises in the same village. So there's simply like this just phenomenal stasis in terms of development in so much of the country. So what that presents an opportunity to do is to differentiate, for Australia, for the United States, really differentiate themselves as not those that are being solving political problems for the governments, but are really taking the risks and doing the difficult hard graft of solving genuine development issues in that part of the world. I said right at the start, one of the first reasons I started doing work in Solomons was around the issue of energy poverty, small-scale energy access issues, diesel dependency, these horrific sort of reliance on the most expensive form of energy for the poorest people in the world. It doesn't make any sense. There hasn't really been any sophisticated approach in Solomons, in much of the rest of Melanesia, to solve that problem. taking sort of a grand mission from the United States, from Australia, from others to help those countries really solve ground up development issues would be a real differentiator in this sort of moment. So I think there needs to be more of that. I'm aware of the complexities of international development. It's not, you can't just click your fingers and shift gears and all that sort of stuff. But now is the point where the US and Australia, it's not just about more money necessarily, but it's about an approach that quite intentionally looks at community level issues, brings them up to the fore, works with local communities as much as you possibly can to solve those very practical, very grassroots issues. That should be Australia's brand. That should be the United States brand in the Pacific, I think.
So I think this gets to one of the struggles that oftentimes we have in the U.S. system, and I think Australia as well, is this idea of pet projects. And you bring this up, this idea of satisfying what the elites want, pouring money into, for example, a stadium for the games, essentially doing what the PRC does. And I guess, your stance is that essentially it is somewhat inevitable that China is going to be in this space, so we differentiate ourselves. I would just push a little bit on that in terms of what at least some U.S. policymakers' perspective might be, that this is really more of an existential situation. And to kind of get at that, I want to go to one of your quotes from the epilogue, which I think really captures sort of the overarching theme here that you're going for. You say that this switch attracted a global community of China hawks to cast their attention towards the islands they'd never set foot on, many of whom saw in the struggle between Sudani and Sogavare a proxy conflict between China and the world, between good and evil. It was typical of a foreign, largely Western tendency to see small developing nations as chess pieces in their geopolitical and ideological struggles. And I think a counterpoint to that some might bring up is that this isn't so much there as in US-China ideological struggles, but this really is something, this is actually about differing views on how the international system should be set up. Something that has significant repercussions specifically for small states like those in the Pacific Islands. For example, the West might point out that the PRC vision of a world order is where large authoritarian states like the PRC and Russia are able to run rampant over sovereignty rights, maritime resources, et cetera. The one vote, one country, one vote in the UN isn't necessarily in China and Russia's interest. So if that is a true belief of the policymakers, how to navigate that? I mean, there may be no perfect answer for this, and this is something we all struggle with. But, how do we prevent China from getting into certain spaces, which I think is where the pet project problem comes in, right? Especially if we're talking something in the security space, even if it's an area where our development dollars may not be best aimed in a certain country. But if that's going there to prevent China from getting into a space that we find strategically significant, how do we weigh that? I mean, that's really, I think, a core problem of where policymakers are struggling.
Fundamentally, I think places like Solomon's cherish their sovereignty, but that actual sovereignty needs to be maximized as much as possible and aided by Western partners. I keep harping on about issues like small scale community energy. We talked about the fact that you had these sort of Chinese firms rolling into individual communities, signing up very unsavory, unpalatable economic deals with those communities. That's the outcome of economic failure in those same communities. You create this whole vulnerable sort of arc of individual villages, communities all over the Pacific that are so hungry for the most basic of economic assistance and opportunity that if charlatans even come into their village and give them a deal that's too good to be true, they'll take it up. The energy issue is a sort of interesting one because it is actually there's this sort of emerging problem in certain developing countries where energy is so acutely lacking, where you have this sort of localized, hyper-localized mini debt trap diplomacy type thing going on, where you effectively have debt burdens accruing at a village scale for local folks that are providing energy assets. These are the types of deficiencies that you have in these countries that exist now. the approach from Australia in particular in Solomons over the last sort of 25 years has been, let's pump all of our money into developing the institutions of state, not a waste of money, of course, like it's important to have a functional judiciary and all this sort of stuff, but that just doesn't fundamentally change the dynamic on the ground. So I think the smarter folks looking for influence in countries like Solomons over the next 15, 20, 30 years are going to be those that are kind of entrenching themselves in relationships at a community level, largely at a provincial level, solving those basic economic problems and creating a sort of economic dependency and economic relationship that can't necessarily be unpicked. And then that does create a broader opportunity for influence. So I think that's kind of the answer. Yeah, there's this big legitimate ideological sort of geopolitical struggle going on in at this level. I kind of agree with that and respect that entirely. It's just that on the ground, people just have this material need, and that's what's going to dictate and shape their behavior. As I said, Pacific countries absolutely cherish their sovereignty. We want to be seen as the partners that are maximizing and enabling that sovereignty and entrenching that rather than a perceived threat to it. And that means we need to behave less paternalistically and really help solve those problems that bring them along with that journey.
And on that, and we're getting really close to time, but I do have one more question on that. You talk about acting paternalistically. One thing that you mentioned in the book and that I often hear of as problematic for the region is some of the labor mobility programs that are out there. And yet this seems to be a real struggle for partners and for those that are aware, labor mobility programs that offer jobs like seasonal worker programs, and oftentimes are more of a brain drain for certain countries. And yet how do we as development partners say that we are, that a option or an opportunity is off the table also for certain people to go and very legitimately choose to make money? So, I mean, what are your thoughts, if you could dive just in the 2 minutes that we have left into the labor mobility issue? Because I think that's really one that Australia and New Zealand especially are really looking at hard.
It's complicated because the labor mobility programs are probably the most effective aid program that exists in Solomons in particular. It is a direct, quick way of getting people serious money. I mean, they come into Australia and earn $30 an hour and go back, and you go into a village and you'll see the person that has benefited from that program. So it's a genuinely beneficial program, but it has, like so many of these programs, another side, which is, yes, it generally favors those that are already likely to do better than others in Solomons, because it favors people with good English language skills, some of those technical qualifications. It is a brain drain. You see people wanting to spend, do that year and year and year, again, and don't necessarily apply their skills and talents to the Solomon Islands economy. Then there's also actually this quite overt and unfortunate existence of low-level corruption where people game the system on the ground, and that's not well policed. So that is genuinely problematic. There's ways, I think, to value add on the labour mobility program. What happens at the moment, people get back into the country and they have, say, 50,000 Australian dollars and they build a house. There's not necessarily any other programs on the return that say, well, here are some, building a house is good. That's a great investment, or it's a great thing to do. What if you wanted to start a business? What if you wanted to do this? What do you want to do that? There's not really much advice or any programs that assist in creative ways to deploy that capital. So I think it's great that we have money coming back into the country. It's not necessarily maximized, its utility there. And then just on the raw sort of implementation of it, I think it needs to be much more diversified. I think Australia and New Zealand in particular should be quite aggressively trying to bring that program to the most disadvantaged communities in Solomons, and that's going to help sort of broadly the economic development of the country by having more people who more money going to remote communities, but also people developing those skills from actually engaging in the workforce in Australia too.
Well, we could definitely spend a lot more time talking about that one, I'm sure, but we are just about at time. And Ed, I really want to thank you for your time today. And thank you to all our viewers for tuning in to a great discussion. To follow more research and analysis and to see what events we're up to, please check out our CSIS.org webpage. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you very much.